Okay. So I think we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Corey. Was mostly with everyone there yesterday? Okay, so, no? Okay, good.
No, I was.
Oh, you were? Okay. During the keynote? Yes. So I said a few things about access then. It all still applies. Just remember to take it, do what you need to do in the next hour and a half. And particularly because it's a smaller room, I really encourage you to interrupt me if you have questions. I want to talk. I've intentionally left a lot of time. I don't have an hour. I'm not going to be talking for an hour. So the hope is that this will be, there's so much to talk about in a topic like disability and sexuality. So the hope is that you'll get what you need, but the only way that's going to work is if you ask questions. I'm not that good at reading minds. Access thing. Again, I'll just mention, just being careful to talk. Like when we're talking, be watchful of crosstalk and talking over each other. Okay. I mentioned yesterday I'm Canadian, and I'm pointing that out again now to say something about language. So language matters. I'll say that too. Maybe I said that yesterday. And a lot of people have the sense that like, oh, it's too much. How do I know how can I keep track of the right words? And my perspective is that there aren't right and wrong words. But language always matters, right? The language we use matters to people. And so what we should be thinking about is how it impacts talking to people. So in this case, I care if I'm using language that bothers people for a few reasons. First of all, I'm like a pleaser and I don't like upsetting people. But also, the goal is that you'll learn something and you'll get something from what I'm saying. And if every time I use a term, you're like, it grates you, or it just has some very like deep, old emotional trigger, it's going to be harder for you to learn. So around that, I'll just explain the language that I use around disability. I can actually talk about what I mean about disability in a second. But you'll notice that I sort of use three terms. So sometimes I talk about people with disability. This is the language in Canada that disability activists, disability communities, and disability academics prefer in Canada. And it's called people first language. Right? So the idea is I'm a person first, so say person with a disability. You'll also hear me talk about disabled people, because as it turns out in the United States, disability activists, and in fact in disability studies, often prefer disabled person for the opposite reason, which is that disability is actually it's a part of who they are, it's part of their identity, and it's something they're very proud of. And they don't feel like a disabled person, because that's what they prefer. And then the third term, sometimes you'll hear me saying, is people who have lived experience of disability. It's much longer, so I say it less. And that speaks to something that's actually more experiential, right? So it's not about an identity. People who lived it, no one really identifies themselves and uses that label like, hi, I'm a person with lived experience of disability, nice to meet you. But the words count, right? So lived experience of disability means people who are living, who are living, number one, and number two, they're experiencing disability in some way. And that may just be that they look disabled, whether that's part of their identity or not, and so everyone treats them like they're disabled. Or in particular, well, we'll get to some other terms, but they have experience that ties them to the disability experience. That's the language I use. If people aren't familiar with this language stuff, and if you don't have disabled people in your life, and you're worried at all about saying the wrong thing, just don't. Like in this room, if someone says something that's like deeply problematic, I promise we can talk about it and we can negotiate in a way that's going to be okay. It's more important for me that you ask questions, and that if you have, just say so, and use the language that you have, and then we'll figure it out. This is my perspective. Let me tell you something very briefly about me, because we didn't do that much yesterday. So I'm a sex educator, I'm a writer. Several years ago I wrote a book with two other people about disability and sex, which is this book. And I made a little note for myself, show book. I'm not very good at selling things. I'm currently non-disabled, but disability. So family, friends, partners, in the past, romantic sexual partners. And of course, the thing is that one day, if I live long enough, I will be disabled. You'll find that I talk about disability a lot as an identity, because that's what it is. It's not exactly the same as other kinds of identities or other kinds of groups because it's a group that anyone can join, right? And eventually we all do. If you live long enough, you'll become disabled. Our bodies fall apart, they stop working. That's what happens. It's very predictable. Obviously, science seems very interested in trying to stop that process, but they're never going to win. So that's, I mean, you may have also noticed, you know, when I talk about myself, I'm non-disabled because that's true. Okay, so a little introduction. Again, just interrupt me whenever you want. I thought we'll start again, like I did last time, with us talking a little bit with each other. So I want you just to turn to the person next to you and talk about what you remember about when you first learned about disability. And it may not be that word. It may have been a different word. It may have been handicapped, may have been weird, may have been may have been words that we find offensive. Whatever it is, whatever you think disability is or whatever you remember, what was the first thing you learned, first thing you saw, and what was it? And so we'll just take a few minutes. Did you find a pen?
Yay!
Thank you. So we're going to take a few minutes. So just pair up with someone. And what are some of your earliest memories of disability, whatever that means to you?
Hi, my name is Melody. Katura, yes, me too. So I guess when I first...
Wait, what, Melanie?
Melody.
Melody. What if there was another snarky?
I guess I just,
So, a really great family friend of ours was disabled when he was 7, so, and he's like older than me, so I just kind of grew up being kind of curious, like, oh, I can't walk, like, I don't think I didn't quite get it, and then like over the course of time I was like, oh, you know, as you get older.
Yeah.
Like as little kids, like, I don't understand.
yeah, you really don't. And like,
It's like, well, how do they do this? Like, they can't do that.
yeah, and it's the same with all kinds of disabilities. Like,
I guess I don't know. A lot of people.
yeah, you're right though. Like when you're a kid, it just seems like, what's wrong with them? I don't understand.
Well, yeah, a lot of times, kids oftentimes are more, you know, like social batteries or social learners, so they're more like outward, you know, and like notice something and not have these sort of kind of like, you know, passiveness about it.
Yeah.
So, you know, there is that to take into account.
Yeah. I guess when I first heard about disability, I don't know, my parents just presented it as just another type of person, just kind of something normal, I guess. But I've seen like my other friends' parents present it as like, those people are weird. So it's really interesting, it's like how it's yeah.
Now that I'm older, that's different, but and I mean, if you go along that disability is like along that line, I think when I was little,
it is, especially because it varies. Like some people are a little disabled, some people are really disabled. Like can't function. So
a lot more. My boyfriend is disabled for I don't know, like it's, like even now it's hard, it's kind of like, I feel sort of like hard, like I can't talk to him about it or ask questions about it, it's really,
feels awkward.
Well, it's not even awkward, it's just like something you definitely talk about, you know? So, I don't know, it's like a hard, it's something that's like challenging to bring up in society and socially, you know, because honestly, like a lot of times people look down on disabilities.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'd be comfortable sharing. When they, I'm always interested to hear a few things. I can kind of hear one or two things, but is anybody comfortable sharing one of the first things they learned?
I remember I was in a parking lot going to some sort of health food store, and there was a disabled person, and my mom was joking and like, oh, well, if you have children, I think since I have children, I can park there.
Okay.
And she was joking, and then I was like, well, what does disabled? And we had a conversation about that.
Cool. And did you see the word disabled on the sign? Like, how did you even know that word?
I feel like I don't know. I feel like she mentioned it or something like that.
Okay. And then do you remember what she told you? Did you ask what disability disabled was?
I don't.
Okay. Great. Thanks.
Yeah, My
Do you mind just sort of tilting a bit, because I don't think from the back to here, but...
my mom, since I was like an infant, she's a social worker who worked with people with disabilities, so I've always kind of been around people with disabilities. It's always been a really big part of my life. Now a teacher who works with disabled people in public schools, and so I've also always been a part of this program called Community Inclusion Program, which is a thing where it's basically like an interactive group of people, disabled and non-disabled, who kind of just get together and do fun things, and it's like a really inclusive environment.
Anyone else? Maybe one more?
So in my family, disability wasn't ever introduced as like, oh, they're disabled, because we had a really good family friend who was put in a wheelchair when he was 2, and so I just grew up knowing like he's just in a wheelchair, you know, like he just can't walk. It was never like, oh yeah, he's disabled. So it just wasn't. It never like occurred to me until I got older that like, oh, that's the word you used for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks. I mean, I think it's an interesting exercise that I encourage you to do because, for a few reasons. One is we don't really talk about it very much. We don't think about sort of when we first learned and what we first learned. And the other thing is that the things that we first learn have a big impact on what we know. And at some point as a professional, maybe you get a technical definition, but actually it's these earlier experiences that really often inform sort of how you work and how you think about it. So that's why I sort of wanted to do that. I should say also, to back up for a second, so I mentioned that I'm currently non-disabled, so when I do this work, I go back and forth. I do the work as an ally, I go back and forth as to whether or not that's a term that I like to use for myself, or if it refers to sort of my approach. But I just want us to be mindful of how easy it is. Usually when I work, I'm working with someone, I have several partners who are disabled, and we work together. And then when I travel, that's not always possible. We're going to have some voices, and there are people in the room who have these experiences, whether or not they get called that, right? Like it's a thing, it's an interesting thing about, like, oh, we never called it that. And it's interesting to think about what that does when disability, it's not some small thing. It isn't actually just that he can't walk. Because if he's in a wheelchair, he's being treated differently by everyone all the time, right? And certainly there's like there's an attitude among sort of some progressive non-disabled people who are like, well, look beyond the disability. I think in the next room they're doing exercises.
Oh, okay. Are they exercises or is it an earthquake?
Like physical exercises.
Freaking.
I think we'll be fine.
I literally feel the floor shaking.
I don't know. But I know. This idea that like the goal here is to look beyond the disability. I'll talk a little bit later about what I think it is that I'm doing, but that's not the goal. Any more than it's okay to say, I don't see color, right? Or we're post-racial, or any of these things that just don't make any sense, not true, they sound good, but...
I hate that word.
Yeah, wait, which one?
I don't see color. Oh my God, that's
right,
the first thing
yeah.
to see in
Yeah.
July. I'm so happy with that.
Yes. Well, and now this newest one is post-racial, right? Which is like a kind of academic, sort of, which is what it's really means to say.
But you're Canadian. You're Canadian. We're not saying that here yet.
Oh, really? Oh, that's
Post-racial? Not in Portland.
Okay. I thought that was a thing tied to Obama.
Wait, what?
Post-racial. Like now that there's a black president.
When you said I don't see color, I immediately thought like, oh, wait, what?
Okay.
I thought,
Yeah, I thought, yeah.
So we'll come back to it. Okay, so I wanna now just get into this thing about what is it that we're talking about when we talk about disability. What are we doing? And sometimes when I give talks, I'm aware that people get around sex and disability because they're expecting to hear sort of like the true story. It's like, okay, I'm going to learn about what it means to be disabled and what disabled sex is like. And in sex research and in education, we still sort of set disability up like it's a discrete topic, right? So when you learn about disability, if you think about like a human sexuality textbook, there's a chapter on reproduction, there's a chapter maybe on pleasure, maybe that's just Canada. But then, like, disability is a separate topic, and it isn't, right? Disability is a lived experience. So I can't give you the real story about sex and disability for a couple of reasons. One is it's not possible. There isn't one real story, right? The other thing is it's actually not my story. I mean, I can talk to you about what it's like to be partnered with someone who's disabled and have sex, but I'm not going to do that because that's personal and private. I mean, if we know each other, I may tell you that, but not as a group. So it's not, for me, this isn't my story to tell. Also, I think that fundamentally, you have a choice here. If you think people have a right to name their own experience and describe their own experience, then you have to let them do that. There's no middle ground. So if you do that, if you say people have the right to describe their own experience, and then you turn around and you say, if you have a spinal cord injury, this is what your sex life is going to be like, those things are conflicting. So that's one reason. The other reason that we're not going to talk about like disability X equals sexuality Y, which is actually how I was trained. So when I was trained in the early 90s, that's what you did. You learned cerebral palsy. This is what cerebral palsy means. This is what your sex life will be like. Is it sets up a really kind of like false and trite approach where we compartmentalize people with disabilities as sort of just being a bunch of body parts that function in a certain way, right? Which is not helpful for them, and it's not helpful for anyone really. The other thing as professionals is that when you learn this stuff, like sometimes we can know too much. There's a woman, disability academic in Canada, and her Tanya, I can't remember her last name, Tchaikovsky, I think. She says everyone knows too much about disability. And she's talking about the stuff that we learn when we're kids. Right? And the problem is that when you learn these things, when you learn about someone who has an injury at a certain spinal region, that means that they're not going to feel this or that. The problem is that when you learn that stuff, that's what you start paying attention to. Right? And so you're sitting across from someone that you're trying to help, or you have a student in the classroom, listening to them or paying attention to them and hearing what they want to tell you. You're waiting for the sign. You're waiting for the boxes you can check. Oh, that disability. So now I have the expert information that says like you won't have an orgasm, or you will have an orgasm. But you can never know that. Okay, so there's not one definition. So instead of a definition, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about frameworks for thinking about disability, and something that people have heard, like people know already, but I'll go through pretty quickly. So I want to talk a little bit about these sort of two models of disability, the medical model and the social model. How many people are familiar with those terms? Okay, great. Okay, and I'll go a little slower, which is great. Okay, so the medical model of disability is the one that everyone knows. It's the prevailing one today. And in the medical model, disability is understood as an individual medical condition, right? It's something that's in your body, an individual has it. And it's treatable, or it's curable. And in the medical model, people with disabilities are broken. They're broken and they're in need of repair. Someone with a disability is fundamentally wrong and broken. Nobody wants to, not have complete vision. Nobody wants to have to use a wheelchair to get around. Those are broken people. And that's the understanding. And the medical model seeks to fix them, right? And what fixing means is make them as close to normal as possible. And we can talk about normal if people want. But the interesting thing about this medical model also with rehabilitation is that if you acquire a disability, and I'll say that in terms of lived experience, there is a big difference for folks that were born with a particular disability and folks that acquire one. And there's not a generalization you can make about that, but those are actually quite different experiences. Simply because you've always known it. It's not strange. It's like growing up with one parent, and people are like, what's it like to grow up with one parent? Well, I've only ever had one parent, so I can't tell you what it's like. Well, I don't know what to compare it to. So in the people who acquire a disability, when they go through rehabilitation, the goal is supposed to be to get them back to the way they were. This is a very strange thing to try to do when it comes to sex, because we are always changing when it comes to sex. So the sexual person you were at 16 is not the sexual person you are at 25 or 65. And so you can never go back. Right? When you're 30, you can't have sex the way you had it when you were 16, because you're not 16 anymore. And when you're 60, you can't have until you were when you were something before that. So the medical model is it's not ideal, it's not perfect. Surprise, surprise. Some of the problems with the medical model are that it denies a major part of people's lived experience. So people don't go around feeling disabled people don't go around feeling broken, right? I was going to say people don't go around feeling broken, but that's not true. A lot of us do. But it doesn't always have to do with the way our bodies are. So when I say, if you say like, HIV is, how horrible must it be? I can't imagine living with HIV. Well, a lot of people who live with HIV don't feel that way about their lives, right? And actually, let me just make a tangent, because I just said it there, and sometimes I use this phrase. This phrase, I can't imagine, is a thing that we do a lot. Like, I can't imagine. And sometimes we do it for, like, I can't imagine what it would be like to win $1 million. And often we do it for, like, I can't imagine what it would be like to be in a wheelchair. And it's something that I used to say all the time, and I try not to say it anymore, because I think that it does a very particular thing, which makes people's lives unimaginable, right? When we say I can't imagine that, what we're saying is that life couldn't be. And if you have that life, it feels bad, right? So certainly, to use a personal example, like as someone who never really fit into kind of gender expectations around boy and girl, and now I work with a lot of parents and kids who can't imagine what that would be like. When that happens, I mean, sometimes I feel like often I just feel lousy. Okay, that's a tangent. So problems with the medical model. One is that it denies major parts of our experience. The other thing is that it compartmentalizes people's experience, right? So when we sort of use the medical model focuses on these very particular, like what's not working, in your genitals, or what's not working in your bones, or what's not working in your lungs. And so it kind of compartmentalizes people into separate bodies, strips them of strength, right? Because the thing is, like, we all have experiences in our body that are positive and pleasurable, and we all have experiences in our body that are not. And that balance is different for different people. But everyone has had some pleasure or joy in their life, including people who live in chronic pain. They may have very little of it. Pain is very devastating to your life, but they still have it. They still have it. And so if we want to support people, we want to help people and work with people, we need to help them find their, notice and find their strengths. And when we know what's wrong with them, we strip them of that strength. So that's another problem with the medical model. Third thing, when it comes to sex, is, of course, the medical model reduces sex to a problem of anatomy and response and pharmacology. Right? So it says what's wrong sexually is that you're not having erections, or you're not having vaginal lubrication, or you're not having orgasms. And sex is always more than that. Sex is all of that, but it's always more. So that's the medical model. And now I've said all sorts of bad things about it. I want to point out that it's not about getting rid of the medical model. Probably here because of the medical model, right? Most of us, if you were born in a hospital, that actually probably was a medical intervention, because that's the way it's treated usually in hospitals. So it's not about throwing it out. It's not an either or. This model is useful and necessary, as are surgeries and drugs and all of that. But there are other ways of thinking about it. Does anybody have questions about that medical piece? Or okay. So the other model that gets talked about is the social model. And so the social model, what they talk about is sort of two terms. They talk about impairment and they talk about ableism. So I'll read this out just up there, but it's a technical thing. So impairment is a physical, emotional, cognitive, and or developmental limitation, difference, and or variation. So it's very broad, right? So an impairment, so I have an impairment because I'm wearing glasses, we know that. An impairment is a fracture in the leg. An impairment is when the spine bifids, essentially, if you form spine bifida. An impairment is people, get impairments in your ears and your eyes. And an impairment is something that's happening in your body, and they matter. So the social model isn't about, it's just about society. We shouldn't even think about people's bodies. People's bodies matter. But the social model gives equal sort of importance and attention to ableism. And so ableism, I'll read out again the definition here, is ableism is the material and social conditions in the world that restrict people with impairments. So what that means is in the world, both physical and social, that make living in the world difficult if you have an impairment. So in Toronto, where I grew up, none of the movie theaters when I grew up were wheelchair accessible. So this is a very obvious example of ableism, is if there's stairs everywhere. So if you use a wheelchair to get around, you couldn't go to the movies. Now you couldn't, it's not true to say, I can't go to the movies because I'm disabled. What's true to say is, I can't go to the movies because they make movie theaters with stairs and no ramps. Right? So if everyone in the world used a wheelchair to get around, using a wheelchair to get around wouldn't be an issue. Right? It's an issue because most people don't, and so we people who use wheelchairs to get around. So that's sort of one example of ableism. I mean, another, to sort of take it more to kind of a sexual realm, what's very common is that bars aren't accessible. Certainly in Toronto, in sort of the gay or queer neighborhood, none of the bars are accessible. It's like a tiny neighborhood, the buildings are all small, everything's upstairs or downstairs. So it's hard to figure out where to meet people. If you're someplace to go and meet people in bars, it's hard to do that if you can't get in. So in fact, your access to dating, to partners, to flirting is restricted. Again, not because of something in your body, but because of this is the material condition of the world. A social example would be our definition of sex, right? So most people think about when they hear sex, they think about penile vaginal intercourse. They think about a man being on top, a woman being on bottom, and this is kind of the understanding of what real sex is. But this is just a definition. It's not the definition I gave. It doesn't describe the sex that I have. But it is, in fact, the thing that most people think about. So what does this mean? This means a bunch of things. So it certainly means if you're not a man and a woman, then you're not having real sex. But it also means that if you can't use your forearms to lift yourself up and use your hips to move in a certain way, this is what sex looks like. Then you can't have real sex, right? This is the definition. This is a social condition of sex, and this is ableism. So social model. So in the social model, the way the world works is seen as an equal problem to differences in how our bodies work. It's an equal problem. Right? Again, we tend to start with like, well, let's talk about you and your body and its individual condition. The social model actually says, you know what? We live in a world, we live in society, maybe we should start there. And the social model acknowledges that barriers to sexual expression are often systemic. Right? They're not about us, they're not individual. Although they're systemic and often passed off as individual. So, so what does this look like? Let me give you an example. So a medical model question, or medical model statement in general would be like, it must be terrible to have a disability, right? Because you can't do things. That's sort of a medical model approach. A disability is terrible because it's your body and you can't do things, and that must be so horrible. In terms of sex, like a medical model question would be something around like, does having a disability make it hard for you to, communicate with your partner or get the sex you want? Social model reframing, which is actually the reframing that most people with disabilities think about in terms of the first thing, is that it sucks to be in a world that excludes you all the time. Right? That's really hard. In a social model reframing around sort of the sex question, it would be like, in what ways are society's ideas of disability getting in the way of you getting what you want sexually? Example, so I don't know if people can sort of get a sense of the difference, just how those things feel different. You say, it's supposed to be terrible to be disabled, and it's terrible to live in a world that's always including you. It feels very different for the person on the other end that's hearing that or that's receiving it. There's an interesting thing that sex educators do where there's one place where sex educators are very good at challenging the medical model. And it was only recently that I realized it, and that's around small penises. So if you work with people with penises, you may know sexually, then you may know that a lot of them care a lot about the size of the penis. This is a big issue. I did not mean that. So anyway, so what do we tell if you're working with someone and they're like, I think it's too small, I can't bring myself to it. get naked in front of someone and have a lot of shame. What do? We say, well, you know what, it's not true, right? We say, first of all, we say it's a myth. We say it's a social idea, right? And then we'll give some scientific facts. So we'll say like, oh, well, if you're having, if you're a woman, did you know that there's like most of the nerve endings are on the outside, or like in the end, they're like clitoral and in the entrance of the vagina. Deep inside the vagina, there aren't a lot of nerve endings. So it doesn't matter if you have a big penis or not. And we'll say like, look, there's some research that says it's not important and it's really important to you. Nobody ever says, yeah, having a small penis must really be terrible. You're never going to actually have the sex you want. Sex educators don't do that ever.
Can't imagine.
Sex educators, I can't imagine like with a small penis. Sex educators, social workers would say that. So we're pretty good there, and we need to kind of take that into it's a related disability because it's about our body. So that was a very quick overview. I'd be interested, does it make sense? Does anybody have any questions about that before I move on? Or any thoughts? Does it seem relevant to people's works?
Yeah, I know as myself as a deaf person, people call me hearing impaired. I just can't hear, that's all.
Right.
But people, for myself with the medical model and the social model, I'm a little bit, kind of confused. I'm just deaf. That's what I, identify myself as, disabled or impaired or, it's kind of hard, but I'm just kind of deaf, that's all. And that's kind of where I fall. And I hope that people, understand that and other people can accept that. Other people see me and they say, oh, you can't hear, that must be horrible to your life. But it's really not.
Right. And also, but I appreciate that you're saying this because these things are complicated, right? And they're not, and it really isn't one or the other. They are actually connected. So in this case, I want to point out, that in fact, impairment itself can be a problematic term, right? It's not like impairment is a term that people use as an identity, and that's sort of the difference with the social model. So the social model would really acknowledge that deaf, and kind of capital D deaf, it's not just an identity, it's actually a culture. And certainly, there's also a disability culture. This is maybe now getting a bit too in depth, but just so you know, so there's a lot of discussion around deaf culture and disability culture, and different deaf people and different disabled people feel very differently about that. So there are some people, some deaf people who feel that they are not disabled, and that's not them, and there's a lot of them who say that's a piece of who I am. But one of the things about deafness is there's an incredibly rich culture. People who are writing and making art and teaching and creating stuff, cultural stuff, that is from a disability perspective. So thanks, and I appreciate the comment because a lot of people I know are sort of moving away from even talking about the sort of medical model, social model, because again, it makes you feel as if, oh, there's these two things, and it's never two things. Everything's always like deeply enmeshed. And so what you want to do when you're working is just figure out and find out how people understand and identify their own experience, right? And go in with as few assumptions as you can. Any other questions or comments about this? If we want. And it's a woman whose name is Jess Sash, and there's some nudity in it, but not a lot of nudity. And it's just her. So we're going to watch it, and then we're going to talk about it. Okay. Well, let's see. I'll start it. Maybe it would be better with the lights off. Can we turn the lights off? Oh no, it's too dark. Okay, maybe just one. That's perfect. Yeah, thank you.
You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. Let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Mary Oliver. Body Language by Jess Sash.
Since the day my spine was fused as a child, it has been resistant beneath my flesh. I decided to pose naked on this plane. I was, and I am, just like you. I feel. I laugh. I love. I grow. When you tell me that I'm brave, don't believe I'm not scared. I was scared that day. The day I tore my clothes off and started taking pictures. To understand, you need to know that I never did this. Let you see me naked. I never let me see. But I needed to find what everyone was staring at. So that day I looked. Hard. Long. Frame after frame. Alone. Scarred. Beautiful. Are you scared? I'm scared each day I try to love myself completely. To understand, you need to know that this is everything. I want you to be scared. I want you to look at these photos and see you. And I want you to imagine loving it all. Every mole, every scar.
The final photograph closes in on an image of a tattoo on her chest, an outline of a ribbon and the word crooked. For Peterborough. Envisioning new meanings of disability and difference. A partnership project. Women with Disabilities and Deaf Women's Program at Springtide Resources. Women's Studies Program at Trent University. Women's College Research Institute at the Women's College Hospital. YWCA of Peterborough and Halliburton. And the YWCA Sudbury. Funding generously provided by the Ontario.
I feel like it's important. They paid for it. This is a video that's actually available. Oh, can you do the lights back on? It's available for free online. This project called Envisioning New Meanings of Disability and Difference actually has invited, I think it was 8 or 9 women in some way as either disabled or living with sort of significant difference, and they taught them how to make films, and they all made films. And you can watch them and you can download them, and they're great. And Jess is a friend of mine. And this is, I'm going to read this. This is this thing that Jess says about this. So she says, this is not just about disability. This is not just about me. This is not about PC and new words to mean disabled without having the name difference. This is not our time to shine. This is not cripples for a cure. This is not about educating the masses and pissing on, or this is not about educating the masses and pissing on pity. This is not art. This is not en vogue. This is not an excuse to get naked. It could be that. This is me. This is her pain. His voice. My words. Our histories. This is a story. This is. So Jess is a performance artist. You may have seen, she did this amazing thing, which is she did an American Apparel ad. Which looked exactly like the American Apparel ad, except it was her and her body. So like the long socks and the silly pornographic poses. And it got a lot of attention. So I think that, it's a small room. I'm going to have a discussion in small groups, but maybe, well, let's just see it. Because it's a small room, maybe we could just talk about it. I mean, I'm interested as to what you think about it.
I had a question. This was, I don't know what you're talking about, but I heard somewhere where people that are mentally handicapped are not allowed to have casual unmarried sex, like that's something that's kind of different with the law. Like, I don't know if it's legal or if it is illegal.
Yeah,
they
okay,
have
so
to be married.
So a couple things. So first, just so you know, just around language, it's slowly. No, you're fine. You're fine. But around language, so in Canada and here, people talk about people with like sort of intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities. Mostly, the term handicap is gone.
Right.
Because handicap really refers to that social piece. Our bodies don't handicap us. This society handicaps us. So that's just a little bit. So the issue is that it's a long story, but if you're labeled developmentally delayed disability or
Is that better? Is that what we commonly come to?
it's not better.
say?
It's just different. Yeah. So developmental disability, cognitive disability. There's lots of different terms. But if someone has labeled you that, and I use that term specifically because there's no science behind any of this.
Right.
There's no science. When you hear someone has the intellectual capacity of a 6-year-old, that's not science. It's a horrible methodology. There's a way that happens. I don't have time to go into it now, but there's no science there. It's not well researched. It's not well anything. So there's no science about any of this. So what happens is, a parent notices that their child is developing a particular way, and they go somewhere, and someone gives them a bunch of tests, and they'll say, your kid has this way, this way. As soon as that happens, in practice, what it means is the kid loses the capacity to consent. Because and certainly I haven't had friends where this has happened, so you could be a 25-year-old or a 45-year-old person and have consensual sex with someone. And if you're someone that has ever been labeled with an intellectual disability, and your parents don't want you to have sex with anyone, your parents can and will just call the cops, have that person they had sex with arrested, and that person can very jail, even if you as an individual go to court and say, I wanted sex. This is my choice. So when you're labeled with a developmental disability or intellectual disability, what happens right away is other people have control over your ability to consent legally.
Even if both the people that were consenting were developmentally disabled and want the same thing.
So this thing about marriage may be did very well in the States, that if you're married, that in courtrooms that seems like a clear enough, like they must be able to consent,
right?
As if no one's ever coerced them to be married. Conversation. So yeah, so absolutely. I mean, people with disabilities are excluded from sort of sexuality all sorts of ways. And yeah.
I heard a story recently about the same thing, in which I think it was people from England, Ireland. A friend of mine works with disabled communities in Ireland, and the law there is that people labeled as such have sex unless they are married. Also, gay marriage is illegal. So queer people labeled as such are never ever legally allowed to have any kind of sex, even if they wanted to get married, which is a whole bigger problem.
Yeah. And certainly, I mean, these early things we learn about disability, right? Our first lessons about what disabled people are, if they have any sexuality, it's straight. Right? The visibility of queer or lesbian or gay or bi or trans people with disabilities is so small that that's never part of something we learn. Other comments about the video? What did you think? Yeah.
Well, this is actually kind of like what we were just talking about.
Sure.
When someone who is diagnosed with developmental disabilities, when they turn 18, there is actually a court held to see if they are capable of making their own decisions. So it's not always, it depends on a lot of things.
Yeah. Yes, it does. And I know that can happen in some places. And what also still happens is parents who want to be very involved can
they usually
override that stuff.
File for guardianship.
Right.
But
So
they have to prove that the person is not able to take care of themselves.
yeah. The deck is stacked against the people, though.
It is. I'm just saying.
Yeah. There are. Yes. It's so. But also, this would be. I mean, this must be a state by state. Or I don't know if it's. Is it more? Can you?
That's how it is in Oregon. I don't know how it is.
Yeah. It's definitely state by state, and I don't even know if it's statewide. I don't actually know how that kind of stuff works. If it's more like a municipal thing, but that the systems aren't set up.
Statewide.
It's statewide. Oh, you're saying it's statewide. Okay, great. Yeah. I think someone. Yeah. Hi.
I think that it's important to note that, from my knowledge, those laws were created to protect people with disabilities.
Absolutely.
And I would be really interested to know how we can improve on that so that there was a way to protect people with disabilities from being abused sexually and physically, and at the same time not take away anyone's choices and rights. Because there's such a hard, that's a difficult thing to do.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, that's someone's life's work, or it's probably, it would have to be everyone's life's work. Yeah, there's not an easy answer to this. I mean, what a disability activist would say would be, why don't the laws that are there to protect you or someone who's non-disabled, why aren't they being used in the same way to protect me? Right. So why do I need different laws? And it's not that it's not that we intellectual capacity does make a difference. We all, and some of us have a harder time moving through the world because of the way we have a hard time moving through the world because the world is set up for people who think a certain way, right? So it's not, again, just to be clear, it's not like everybody's fine and everyone should just be able to do whatever they want. But then there's also this thing about laws that are set up to protect us in the ways that they don't always. Like that, you're right. I don't think anyone's set up well. With disability, it's a bit tricky because, in fact, in this country, there's a law in the government, right? So it's not actually fair to even say around disability that the laws are all well-meaning.
No.
Whereas you might
there aren't any laws.
Okay, fine. Well, everyone feels differently about this stuff, but so yeah. I mean, and what I can say is I feel like it's happening in small ways in small places, right? So that, there are individual institutions that serve people with developmental disabilities that are trying to have a more supportive approach. It's not happening in Canada or the US on any, because there's no interest, right? Because the thing is, who has the power? It's parents. And the truth is that most parents never want their kids to have sex, right? So when when I work with parents with kids with disabilities, it's just about the hardest people to work with. I mean, doctors are the hardest people to work with. I think doctors in the room. I usually ask that first. But because it's easier for them to have all the power, and they're people too, right? They have I understand parents not wanting their kids to have sex. It's not the way I feel about it. It's not realistic, right? Any other thoughts about the video or
I really liked it. I thought it was very inclusive because we have so many issues with body image in our culture. The part about imagining that this is you and loving every single part of your own self. I think that can be a challenge for anyone, no matter what their body looks like.
Yeah. Thanks. And I think educator more and more, this is where I start. I start with bodies, and I never used to, but because it's something we all have. And so it is. I appreciate what you're saying, and it is nice to find, and certainly Jess is interested in finding points of connection. And it's not all about difference, and a lot of it is about what we share. And it's interesting because I feel like, and we'll see if Marietta finishes it with her keynote, but I feel like every keynote has at least touched on this fact that everyone feels some shame about sex, and most of us feel some shame at some times. So it's I find it a very useful place to start because it's something everyone can kind of identify with. One more maybe? Yeah, hi.
You mentioned shame about sex. I was just curious, why in the first place do we feel shame about sex? What's your ideas about that?
Well,
it's handed down.
Yeah.
It's something that we get really unconsciously, that there's something bad about it. I'm not sure that the intention is for us to think that it's bad, but I have had students ask. They didn't ask me, but I asked them, or they've asked other teachers, lick each other's vaginas. We've had that question. And the teacher got really embarrassed and automatically said, oh, that's just bad. So, historically, teachers sometimes think that bodies are bad and pass along that information that's bad, and I think it just makes things worse. I know for myself, I went to Inca one time, and I was like, oh my God, people are just laid down on the beach, in their bathing suits, they don't care, they walk around, they're showing their stuff. People are making out right in front of everybody. Here in the United States, it's like, oh my God, they're touching! Oh, there's something going on in the room. It's so panic-stricken here. And I think that's a part of our culture, of our history in this country, that we have all this shame that is not the same in other countries. They don't have the same thing going on.
I agree with all that.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think that it's, and I mean, and particularly this part about like it's in us. It's deep inside of us, and I mean, I think I'm wary of this. Sometimes people say like, well, that doesn't happen in other places. I think it looks different in different places.
Yeah.
But I mean, whatever. I mean, when we treat sex is always segregated. It's this thing. I mean, if you just think how we raise kids. I mean, we raise, if you raise a child, you want them to learn things, right? You're excited about it. They learn words,
yeah,
right? They learn what different things are and how they work, except if they have anything to do with sex, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, that's some small thing, but it is, yeah, we're pretty messed up.
Yeah.
And so it's not that I think it always has to be that way per se, but. I don't know what. I mean, there'll be small changes, and there are small changes also.
This is
Yeah.
a tiny example, but I used to work, and the parents would come in and they'd look at the rating. They'd be like, "The violence is okay. If there's one boob in that video game, they're not allowed to have a Call of Duty. Shoot as many people, Grand Theft Auto, shoot as many people, there's many cops. If there's any nudity, if there's any sex, I will not buy it." Just a small example. Violence is okay, sex is not.
I'm the opposite with my children.
Well, that's kind of how it is in my house.
Raising sex-positive children, I feel, is very difficult when you're in society that's like, no, you can't have sex. My boys, and I feel it's especially important to teach young children this, like teaching young boys about consent. I feel like I'm doing something that no one has ever done before because I talk to other parents and they're like, what do you mean you're teaching them no means no? I'm like, no fucking means no. Like, I didn't freak out when, they were playing doctor or whatever, but I was like, well, did you make sure she was okay with it? And he's like, 5. My ex-husband lost his shit, and I was just worried if he got her permission.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like parents are like part of like making people feel like they shouldn't be having sex, and just that part of that shame factor. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard when you're a parent because you have all of the stuff to, I mean, first of all, I mean, you're parenting in a way that matches your values and your beliefs, and you've obviously done work around this for yourself. But not everyone gets a chance to.
Yeah.
Or not everyone makes the time to, I mean, however you want to put it. So, yeah.
You're also competing with a lot of other factors besides parenting.
Right. You're parenting your kids in the world.
Yes.
So you can do everything you want in the home. I mean, so when I'm working on the second book for kids, and it's very interesting because I'm constantly having to balance between writing for the world that I want and writing for the world that we live in. And when you're writing for little kids, what's cool is like they haven't been totally screwed up yet. Right? So they've already been screwed up on gender because they get that before they're even born. Right? So they understand there's boys and there's girls, and there's only 2 options, and if you are this, then you must be that. But around sex, because no one talks to them about it, they're already taking little things in. There's like an opportunity to say something positive, but they're in the world. And a good example, this is a total tangent, but for a second, is the word sexy. Right? So sexy is this very common word for like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds now, because of music videos and because of pop culture. And so kids use this word all the time. They skid into the kitchen. They're like, I'm so sexy. I'm doing a sexy dance. Or, all kids come and so it's an interesting question because so is that okay? And like the world that we live in includes a lot of people that do. A lot of people. The world that includes people who are sexually inappropriate with young people. So the young people do need to know about that. So the idea of them kind of talking with themselves sexy and for a 9-year-old doesn't seem right. And then at the same time, if what sexy is feeling good about your body, then isn't that a good thing? I mean, there's not an answer to this, but it's complicated. Yeah.
My kid was probably like 6, 5. I forgot which kid it was. Because I have a couple kids. And he's like, I'm sexy and I know it. Right. And I'm like, do you even know what that means? He's like, yeah, it means shiny. Right. Saying, I'm shiny and I know it. And he's like, oh, well, yeah, okay. I feel like asking because if they know what words even mean, it's probably like a good...
That's the best place to start. And that's exactly right. When you think about what kids see, it's like, yeah, shiny. Like sparkly, fun. I mean, the people who are calling themselves sexy on music videos, they seem like they're having a lot of fun. And often they're funny. Okay, we should get back to the topic at hand. So, let me just, I'm going to say, sort of just, I want to kind of actually just wrap up, and then we're going to have more time for questions, and if people have specific stuff about disability, I want to hear about it. So I always start my talks talking about access, and I do sometimes use this term accessible sex. And I think the argument for this talk, the title was Better Access Through Sex and Better Sex Through Access. The argument is that accessible sex is actually the best sex you can have. And that's because of what accessible sex means. This thing I was saying yesterday, for something to be accessible, it needs to be about what you need to be present in the space, right? So that might mean I need a ramp to get into the room. It might mean I need the room not to be very loud because it's harder for me to think when there's a lot of noise. It might mean that I need people not to joke about sex because actually for me sex has always been a sight of a lot of pain. And so actually when we tell jokes about sex, I'm out. And I can sit there and pretend that I'm here, but I'm not. It could mean anything. And so accessibility, accommodation starts with a need. The question is, what do you need? So commonly when people know that I talk about sex and disability, people may, particularly younger people will say, like, how do you masturbate if you don't have any hands, right? And it happens too. I worked in sex stores. You may know that from signs yesterday. I used to work in sex stores, and people would come in, and say, how can I do this? There's a lot of disabled people, because they are so excluded, very much see themselves as non-sexual. And the thing is, they say, like, how can I have sex? And the first question I ask is, well, what does it mean, right? And what do you want to do? So does that mean you want to feel good in your body? Does that mean you want to make someone else feel good in their body? Does that mean you want to connect with, you want to have a relationship? Does it mean you want to feel powerful or popular or weird? You want to do something totally messed up? Have an orgasm? Does it mean you want to have a kid? And I'll give a long list of things, which of course is just a beginning list, and say, what is it that you want? And let's start there. And the truth is that I've never ever had an experience where we haven't figured something out. Right? Not everyone can have sex the same way. Not everyone can have intercourse. Not everyone can have an orgasm. Some people won't ever have orgasms. But everyone can find a way to be sexual and express their sexuality. And the truth is that, what do you want? What does sex mean to you? It's actually the place that we should all start thinking about our sex lives. And none of us, particularly if you're straight and you're non-disabled or you look non-disabled, if you more or less can pass as non-disabled, then you watch Oprah, you do Dr. Phil, you read People magazine, and you have this, or you watch movies, and you think like, oh, now I know how to have sex. Like, it was interesting that video, the Jimmy Kimmel clip, when Jimmy Kimmel said to them, do you know how to do it? It's like, well, they know how to do it in the world, and we see examples of sex. Those examples are narrow, not actually very much fun, usually. You get like 2 or 3 options, you have to do it all in the same order, it's always in your bedroom, with the lights out. Those are your options, right? But if we thought about accessible sex for everyone, and the question is, what is it you want? And then what can you do? What's going to work for you? What's going to work for your body? You'd have much better sex. So that's sort of my last little sort of general thing. We have about 10 minutes, or maybe a little less than 10 minutes. Oh, we have right at 12. Okay, yeah, like 10 minutes. And I really want to know. I don't know if people are working, like if disability is relevant to your work, and if it is, if stuff has come up. But you can feel free to ask questions now. Also, on the screen is my email, and you can email me anytime. You can email me now. You can email me 10 years from now. So far, I figured out a way that I spend a lot of my time answering those questions for free, and I have a lot of resources that I can share. So feel free to do that if you don't like talking to groups. But I would be, I'd be interested. I'd just like to know, is this relevant to people's work? And if it is, can anyone share what they do for a living and why it's relevant?
I work in a dialysis clinic.
Okay.
A lot of people with kidney failure, and so most of the time they have not had this their entire life. And the particular social worker that we have is not not very good, and they do not like her at all.
Right.
And she tends to ask very upfront. They tend to be an older generation, and she tends to ask very upfront questions about their sex life, which they do not appreciate. But I think a lot of them are definitely having problems with this. Some of the women I've connected with, obviously. Is there anything I can possibly do to help them be able to talk with us about their social worker or their loved one or anything?
Yeah.
It's a very empty part of their lives now.
And what's your role?
I'm
You're an
just
educator, or you're a
I am
technician?
the technician.
You're a technician. Okay. Great that you're even thinking about this. So, I mean, the thing is about more like planting seeds rather than forcing people to talk, right? So, I mean, people do all sorts of different things. So what a lot of people actually will, like, even if they aren't lesbian or gay or queer in some way, they'll have like a rainbow something, a rainbow pin, because that's what we sometimes see. It's like, oh, that's a gay thing, which, even though it's incorrect, people often think, oh, it means like it's nothing but sex. If there's a way of sort of marking yourself as someone who is comfortable with people asking questions, if there's any like office type space where you can have materials, you should email me and I can help figure out, like, there might be a poster, there might be some pamphlets. Having a book, and it doesn't have to be this book, but if you can have a book, and in fact, you know, it doesn't. I mean, this book has the word sex and disability in the title, so that's useful. Yeah. But if you think it's too much, there's like another book that's called Enabling Romance, which is about sort of relationships.
Well, I work for so
right.
It's very corporation-y
right,
about
but
it, so if I left it out, you know.
Yeah,
but
there might be something, you have it available. I mean, even having a reading list. I think being someone who's open, the other thing is, like, if you're open to the conversation, I think people will sense that, right? And so then to me it's like affirming, right? When people said, like, that social worker just scared me, but I do have questions. It's like saying, yeah. It doesn't, like, your sex life or your sexuality and gender, you can use whatever words are kind of gentle, look different for everyone. But it's good to have questions because because your body's changing and our bodies are, and then offering, to be something that could offer some resources. Yeah. You can also push the social worker to, come to this conference or get better at what they do.
She wouldn't recommend more, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah. But if you're looking for specific resources, you can email me.
Definitely.
Yeah. Other questions or comments?
For me, I guess I was hoping to find out a little bit about, making sex education more accessible for people with disabilities. Of course, we talked about deaf. I work with deaf children, in third grade, 8th grade, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, middle school age. That education seems really hard. I don't know. Deaf people, it seems that they're really, there's a big gap in education related with sex. And, like, for example, this is a true story, no lie. So we were talking about puberty, and so there was a word there, and there were different, their appropriation, and, they don't know the appropriate words, and, there's so many misconceptions and misunderstandings from TV and their friends, and so, I don't know, I guess for me, I'm just hoping that you could maybe, share a little bit with me about how to, make sex ed more accessible for people who have disabilities.
So, well, we should email. Because I can make some suggestions, but there are a few people doing, like, a few deaf sex educators, but very few. I mean, as you know, it's like they are very small communities and often very conservative. I say start with the kids, like start with the people you're teaching, and I would start by asking, in another second language, and learning sex words in English first. So I would want to know about what signs, like, about what do they know? What do they think when they see the word sex, when they see the sign sex? Because all kids have experience, right? The thing is, so kids, disabled kids and deaf kids and non-disabled and hearing kids, they all have experience in their bodies. And, well, grade 7, grade 8, now it's becoming sexual. But early on, it's not something that we would think of as adult sexuality, but for example, they know that their bodies can feel good. They know that some parts of their bodies feel better than others. They probably know that if they touch certain parts of their bodies, nobody notices. They scratch their cheek. they fall over, touch other parts of their bodies, like put their hands down their pants, people notice and freak out. And those are the kinds of places that I would start, because these are experiences that everyone has. You know, the other thing is, in terms of like, so making sex education accessible is about letting people be in the room and starting with that. You know, and then the other piece of it, the other big part about sex education for me is about teaching kids to be critical thinkers. So, you know, so you could have stuff around looking at hearing in English language culture and talking about what sexuality looks like in that culture and how does it look different in deaf culture. And if the response is blank, like, well, we've never seen it in deaf culture, which I don't think would be the response if the kids feel like they can talk, or if they can share with you. But if that is the response, then you can talk about that. Is that helpful? Yeah. But it's equally. Yeah. Okay. And then my other sort of response is, you should write some lessons. But it's true, right? I mean, someone has to start somewhere, and there isn't, and really most of what's out there is translating. It's English language, and it's hearing culture, and so that often is a problem. I do have the one other thing I'll say is I have some resources. There's a good program in Toronto for adults. It's an HIV, it's like a deaf and hard of hearing HIV program. So there's someone that I can connect you with there, but not necessarily so great for grade 5. Other questions? We'll have time for one more question, comment. Yeah.
I'm curious about more information about sex surrogacy and what the role can play in allowing people to experience their sexual expression in certain ways. It's not something I know much about.
Okay. So the term sexual surrogacy or sex surrogate refers to, I mean, there's a kind of history that started in the 70s, and it actually started with Masters and Johnson. And it started, the surrogacy started because came to sex therapy, and they wanted, so a man came for premature ejaculation, and he didn't have a partner. And Masters and Johnson were like, well, the way we treat people is we have them go and do stuff sexually, and we want them to do, it's better if they do it with someone else rather than just themselves. So that's how sexual surrogacy began. So sex surrogate is has some sort of training and is working with someone often in a hands-on, closed-off way that's vaguely understood to be therapeutic. The truth is that if you Google sex surrogate now, lots of sex workers use that term. So it's a bit of a gray area. And there was a movie called The Sessions most recently that was this guy Mark O'Brien, who's a disabled poet and journalist, and it showed him as a sex surrogate. So people have different feelings about this, right? I mean, to me, if someone has access to something, then I think everyone should have access to it. So my feeling about sex work and sexual surrogacy is, yeah, it should be accessible. Whether or not we need someone specialized to work with us, I don't know. So my experience is when I get calls, I usually refer people to sex workers that I know. Because in my experience, sex workers are better at this stuff than sex surrogates. Sex surrogates are often trained to think they're better than sex workers. They're also trained to think they're experts, and I just don't find it very useful to send anyone to an expert. So I just don't, right? I mean, anyone who thinks they're an expert, right? To have a bunch of knowledge is great, and to know more than the people you're working with is necessary.
But to think you know all.
But to think that you know all, that is exactly right. Right? That's the distinction. So there's one exception, which is a very good program. So in Israel, the government actually pays for sexual surrogacy. It's a history of because military duty is required, and so you have a lot more young people that are disabled, and the government pays for all of their care. And so if you acquire disability in the military, you come back and you're having difficulty getting erections or being aroused or depression or whatever it is. There's one clinic that trains surrogates, and they actually do a very good job. But it's a very non-American, non-North American model. And she's very clear with the fact that she doesn't hire people that have any kind of training around disability or rehabilitation. She hires people that are comfortable in their bodies. Yeah, I mean, there's also a piece just to be aware of, which is sort of a debate, discussion in disability communities. Where there's some people who are like, I don't, you know what, I already have to have all these people helping me. I have to have all this assistive technology. I don't want another one, right? So when I worked in sex stores, there were people like I find it offensive that you're talking about vibrators. So that is some people's opinion. Other people think of assistive devices as being freeing, and they love them, and they have emotional relationships with them, and they're quite happy to have sex with lots of different people. But just to be aware of it, it's definitely like it's not something to kind of go in with. Like it's not like this is going to solve everything, but it can be useful. The other thing that's a bit useful about it is it does exist in a grayer legal area. So in Canada, I refer people to sex workers all the time, even though it is illegal for you to do it. I have no, sorry, it's time to end. I have no concern about getting arrested for doing that. I might be more worried in the States about getting arrested for doing that. And in California, it's not like quasi-legal. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you. Again, feel free, like this was just an hour, so feel free to contact me anytime. There you go.
Go. Thank you.
I actually switched to this one because I reread the thing for the workshop I was going to. I'm like, I think this might be too basic. I think I might already know all this information they're going to give you. Which is strange because I never expected to have enough information to go to a workshop and be like, oh, I already know all this. And so it's been a new experience coming to this conference when I go, oh, wait, I already know all that. Like, I need to go to a different workshop. Come here a couple years. Well, work with our group, and you learn things pretty quick. Our group? Yeah. Like, I feel like most of the LGBTQ alphabet students, like,